The streets of Athens in 2021 felt deceptively peaceful, bathed in the soft golden glow of a late spring evening. The city hummed with the quiet rhythm of everyday life, its vibrant energy belying the storm that was about to break. In a quiet suburb, on a Tuesday evening that seemed like any other, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the streets, a scream that would mark the beginning of one of Greece's most shocking tragedies. Caroline Crouch, a young woman with a radiant smile and a life that seemed straight out of a fairy tale, had recently become a mother. Her newborn daughter, Lydia, was only a few months old, still learning to trust the world with her tiny hands and wide, innocent eyes. Caroline, too, was learning to navigate motherhood, her heart full of love for her daughter, but also heavy with the weight of her marriage to Babis Anagnostopoulos, a man who appeared to have it all. A successful helicopter pilot, wealthy, confident, and admired. On the surface, Babis seemed to be the perfect husband, the perfect father. They lived in a beautiful modern home, nestled in the picturesque suburbs of Athens, where the sun set gently behind the hills and the Mediterranean breeze whispered through the trees. But within the walls of their home, things were far from ideal. No one could have guessed that behind the smiles and the picture-perfect family photos, there was a woman suffocating under the weight of control and manipulation. The morning after the scream, the police arrived at the scene. The house was eerily quiet, the door slightly ajar, as though everything had been frozen in time. The usual signs of a robbery were there, drawers pulled out, belongings scattered across the floor, but nothing of real value had been taken. It didn't make sense. Caroline's lifeless body was discovered in the living room, her face frozen in a final, silent scream. Her infant daughter, Lydia, was safely tucked into her crib, unharmed. There was a strange contrast between the chaos of the scene and the peaceful innocence of the child. Babis was the one who had called the police, his voice trembling with panic as he claimed that masked intruders had broken into their home and attacked his family. At first, the officers believed him, rushing to the scene and assuming it was a robbery gone wrong. But even then, something felt off. The crime scene was too neat, too staged. It didn't add up. As the investigation began to unfold, a dark truth began to emerge. The police started to question the inconsistencies in Babis' story. The intruders, if they were real, had taken nothing of value, just a few items that seemed randomly chosen. The house, still filled with expensive possessions, had been left untouched. It was clear to the detectives that something deeper, something far more sinister, was at play. As they dug into Babis' past, they uncovered a side to him that no one had suspected. To the outside world, he was the perfect husband, the loving father, the successful professional. But behind closed doors, he was a man of lies, manipulation, and control. It was a truth that Caroline had lived with for years, though no one knew the extent of it, until now. Caroline had been just 15 when she met Babis. He was 27, already an established helicopter pilot with a charm that seemed to captivate everyone around him. He swept her off her feet, sending her love notes written in the sky, his helicopter soaring over her school to catch her attention. At first, it seemed like a harmless crush, a whirlwind romance. But as time passed, the age gap between them became more apparent, and so did the control Babis exercised over her. When Caroline was 18, still a teenager by most standards, she had eloped with Babis, choosing him over a traditional Greek wedding, over the expectations of her family. But that choice would prove to be the start of a life she would come to regret. In the early days of their marriage, Babis was affectionate, showering her with love and attention. But slowly, like the creeping chill of winter, his true nature began to emerge. He was possessive, controlling, and manipulative. He isolated Caroline from her friends and family, turning her world into a small, confined space where she had little room to breathe. He controlled their finances, making it nearly impossible for her to leave if she ever wanted to. The facade of a perfect marriage was just that, a facade. On the outside, they were the picture of a happy family. But behind closed doors, Caroline had been living in a prison of her own making. The dream of independence, of a life she could call her own, had slowly been stripped away by the very person she trusted most. When Lydia was born, the weight of her marriage became too much for Caroline to bear. The birth of her daughter, once a symbol of hope, had only deepened her despair. The cracks in their marriage became impossible to ignore. Caroline began to plan her escape, reaching out to friends with cryptic messages, trying to find a way out. But every attempt to break free was met with more control, more manipulation. That fateful night, the one that would end Caroline's life, was the culmination of years of psychological and emotional abuse. Her dreams of freedom had been extinguished in the cruelest way imaginable. The perfect family, the perfect husband, the perfect life, all of it was a lie. And as the investigation unfolded, the truth would be even darker than anyone could have imagined. Babis, the man who had seemed like the epitome of charm and success, was revealed to be capable of a darkness that shattered everything in its wake. May 11th, 2021 began like any other night in Glyconera, a peaceful suburb of Athens. The evening air was warm and the streets were quiet, with families tucked into their homes. But by morning, the calm was shattered, and chaos had gripped the neighborhood. Babis Anagnostopoulos' voice, trembling with panic, echoed through the phone lines as he made the emergency call. His words painted a chilling image of masked intruders breaking into his home, tying him up, and suffocating his wife, Caroline, in front of their infant daughter. It was a nightmare that no one could have imagined, a family shattered in the most horrific way possible. When the police arrived, what they found didn't match the story Babis had told. Caroline's body lay lifeless on the bed, her face pale, and her body showing signs of a violent struggle. The peaceful infant, Lydia, was asleep in her crib, untouched, while the family dog, Roxy, was found lifeless, hanging from its leash outside, a detail that turned the already disturbing crime scene into something incomprehensible. Why harm an innocent animal in such a cruel way? Babis, still bound with duct tape in the living room, had claimed that 3 masked men had stormed into their home, ransacking it, demanding money and valuables. His story seemed clear at first, but something about the way he spoke unsettled the investigators. There was no true panic in his voice, no signs of genuine fear. His words were calm, almost rehearsed. It was as though he was telling a story, not recounting a nightmare. As the investigation deepened, a picture began to form. A picture that didn't fit the narrative Babis had woven. The crime scene seemed staged. Drawers were pulled out, but the valuables remained untouched. Expensive jewelry, cash, and electronics, all left behind. Why would thieves leave everything of value? Why wouldn't they take the money, or at least the jewelry that was right in front of them? It didn't make sense. Forensic experts also noted that the duct tape binding Babis's hands was too loose enough for him to have freed himself easily. If he had been tied up so securely, how was he able to make the emergency call? The media had initially bought into the idea of a violent home invasion. The image of Babis distraught and holding his daughter as he spoke to reporters was heart-wrenching. The nation rallied behind him, mourning the loss of Caroline, a young mother taken too soon. The tragic scene played out on the screens of millions, and for a time it seemed like a terrible crime committed by faceless strangers. But as the days passed, something shifted. The more the police uncovered, the more the case began to feel less like an open and shut home invasion, and more like a dark, twisted puzzle that no one could solve. As investigators dug deeper into Babis's story, the cracks in his account widened. Their focus shifted from the idea of foreign criminals to the man who had called for help. Babis's calm, almost detached demeanor in interviews, his lack of visible grief, and the inconsistencies in his statements, these things began to stand out. Meanwhile, the evidence from Caroline's fitness tracker told a story that contradicted Babis's timeline. Her heart rate had been recorded hours after he claimed she was dead, suggesting she had been alive long after the supposed attack. Security cameras in the neighborhood, which had been relied upon to capture the intruders, had failed to show any sign of suspicious activity. Then, there was the heartbreaking detail of the family dog. Roxy's death seemed too senseless, too cruel for a professional thief to commit. Why harm the dog? Why hang it from a leash? It didn't fit with the story of organized criminals, and it only deepened the mystery. Caroline's parents, devastated by their daughter's death, began to ask their own questions. Caroline had been unhappy in her marriage for some time. They knew that much. In the weeks before her death, she had confided in her mother, hinting at plans to leave Babis, to take Lydia and escape the life she had been living. She dreamed of a fresh start, away from the controlling and manipulative man she had married. But her dream of freedom would never come to be. As Babis's story crumbled, the investigation shifted focus. No longer was it about an anonymous home invasion. It was about the man who had once seemed like the perfect husband and father. Behind closed doors, Babis had been controlling Caroline, isolating her from her family and friends. She had been living in a gilded cage, too afraid to leave, too trapped to escape. Now, the questions turned darker. Was his grief genuine, or was it a performance? The truth, it seemed, was far worse than anyone had imagined. The grieving husband, the distraught father. Those were the masks Babis wore. But beneath it all, there was a man capable of unspeakable cruelty. The image of the perfect family, the perfect husband, had been a lie. And so, the investigation continued, with each new discovery making the picture clearer. The man who had once been a symbol of public sympathy was now the prime suspect in his wife's brutal murder. The tragedy of Caroline's death had gone from a shocking home invasion to a story of manipulation, control, and betrayal. A story that would unfold in front of a nation desperate for answers. As the days bled into weeks, the investigation into Caroline Crouch's murder seemed to stall. But beneath the surface, things were changing. The initial theory of a botched robbery was slowly being called into question. The investigators, exhausted and frustrated, found themselves inching closer to a truth they had barely dared to imagine. The police first focused on the Georgian suspect, a man with a criminal past and known ties to the Albanian crime groups that operated in Athens. He was arrested and questioned relentlessly. For hours, his silence was unnerving. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, a key problem soon emerged. The man had an airtight alibi. He hadn't been anywhere near Glyconera the night Caroline was killed. The police, desperate for answers, were forced to release him. Another lead had fallen apart. Next, they turned to the possibility that an Albanian crime group had carried out the murder. These gangs were infamous for targeting wealthy families, leaving a trail of destruction and fear in their wake. Investigators spoke to known associates and scoured every piece of evidence, hoping to find a link. But as they dug deeper, the theory seemed less and less likely. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of the typical gang violence that had been expected. The house was too neat, the valuables too untouched. The story didn't add up. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived from an unexpected place: digital evidence. Caroline's phone records, along with data from smart devices in the home, revealed a timeline that shattered Babis's version of events. Her fitness tracker had recorded her heart rate late into the night, far longer than Babis had claimed she was alive. The timestamps from security cameras, which had been set up in the neighborhood, showed nothing. A complete blank when Babis said intruders had been lurking around the house. The most chilling revelation came from Caroline's phone itself. Messages, sent in the hours before her death, painted a picture of a woman trapped in an unbearable situation. Caroline had reached out to close friends, expressing fear and desperation. She hinted at her plans to escape, to leave Babis and take Lydia with her. She had even booked a hotel room for the night of May 11th, a quiet refuge where she could gather the strength to start a new life. But as the investigation would later reveal, Caroline had canceled the reservation just hours before she was killed. That final agonizing decision to stay, to return to the home where she had been suffocated emotionally and physically, would ultimately cost her life. Babis had painted a picture of their marriage that seemed almost idyllic, but those who knew Caroline best began to open up. She had confided in her mother about the tension in her relationship, the ways in which Babis had isolated her from her family and friends. They had spoken about his controlling behavior, the constant surveillance, and the terrifying threats he had made to take Lydia away if Caroline ever tried to leave him. Caroline's dream of escaping, of carving out a life for herself and her daughter, had been crushed, slowly, methodically, by the man who was supposed to love and protect her. As the investigation continued to peel back the layers of Babis's life, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade became glaringly obvious. There was mounting evidence of his financial troubles, his career slipping through his fingers, and his growing debt. His life, once polished and perfect, was disintegrating. His marriage to Caroline, which he had desperately tried to control, had become a threat to everything he had worked for. Caroline, with her plans to leave him, represented the end of the world Babis had so carefully built. And then the most chilling realization began to settle over the investigators. The crime scene didn't match Babis's account. The more they examined the evidence, the clearer it became that the murder was not a random act of violence. It was the product of a mind that had meticulously planned the whole thing, a mind that had manipulated the situation to ensure that the perfect life, the perfect marriage, would remain intact. The more Babis spoke, the more his version of events seemed rehearsed, calculated. The timeline he had given never quite added up. The duct tape that was supposed to have bound him wasn't consistent with the marks on his wrists. The intruders he spoke of, masked men who had come in the night to terrorize his family, seemed more like a convenient lie. The evidence, piece by piece, was beginning to point back to him. Babis had tried to mask his guilt with grief, to create the image of a loving husband and father who had lost everything. But as the investigation pressed on, the truth was becoming undeniable. The man who had once appeared as a grieving, helpless widower was now the prime suspect in the murder of the woman he was supposed to protect. And with each new piece of evidence, the horrifying truth about what really happened that night was beginning to surface. As the investigation into Caroline Crouch's murder continued, the true horror of her death went beyond the violence of the crime scene. It revealed the suffocating reality of her marriage. What had initially appeared to be a botched robbery was uncovered as something far darker, a story of manipulation, control, and emotional abuse. Babis Anagnostopoulos, the seemingly perfect husband, had created an illusion of a happy family that masked the disturbing truth of his marriage. As detectives sifted through the evidence, they began to piece together the heartbreaking final moments of Caroline's life, and it became clear that her death was not a random act of violence. It was the tragic result of a relationship where control had been the currency of love. The most revealing piece of evidence came from an unexpected source: Caroline's diary. Found by her parents, who had no idea of the extent of their daughter's suffering, the diary entries painted a harrowing picture of a woman trapped in a marriage that had become a prison. Each page was a silent cry for help, detailing her slow suffocation under Babis's control. She had been isolated, manipulated, and tormented by the very man who was supposed to protect her. Caroline had tried to leave before, but Babis always found a way to reel her back in, by controlling her finances, her movements, and even her access to help. Her diary reflected her growing fear for their daughter, Lydia. Caroline wrote about her constant worry that Babis would take Lydia from her if she left. She knew that escaping meant risking everything, including her bond with her child. Despite this fear, Caroline began planning her escape for the night of May 11th. She booked a hotel room, arranged a flight, and took steps to break free. But that night would be her last. Her final entries were filled with dread and hopelessness. She had reached a point where she knew time was running out. Her pleas for help became frantic. "I need to leave," one message read. "I'm scared," another. "I can't do this anymore." But by the time the night ended, those messages would never be sent. Investigators soon discovered that Babis had been meticulously monitoring Caroline's every move. He had installed surveillance cameras and used tracking apps on her phone. He knew she was planning to leave, and instead of stopping her, he made a decision that would change everything. His control was slipping, and he couldn't bear to lose everything. That night, Babis staged a crime scene claiming that masked intruders had broken into their home, murdered Caroline, and tied him up. But the evidence quickly exposed his lie. Caroline had not been killed in a violent struggle with strangers. She had been smothered, likely while she slept, in a fit of rage and control. To make the scene appear more brutal, Babis killed the family dog, Roxy. He then called the police, pretending to be a victim of the attack, and played the part of the grieving husband. Yet his calm demeanor and lack of genuine emotion raised suspicions. As the investigation continued, more details about Babis's life emerged. His mounting debts, financial troubles, and slipping career all came to light. His perfect life, carefully built on lies and control, was crumbling, and Caroline, the woman who had been trying to escape, had become the symbol of his impending downfall. When Babis finally confessed, there was no remorse in his voice. His cold, calculated words revealed a man who had been pushed to the edge by his inability to control every aspect of his life. He admitted to killing Caroline, but he did so without any hint of guilt, as though the act was simply the result of his crumbling world. The truth behind Caroline's death was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just the murder that shocked the world. It was the years of emotional abuse, manipulation, and control that had preceded it. Babis was no longer seen as the tragic widower he had portrayed himself to be, but as a cold-blooded killer who would stop at nothing to preserve his perfect life. The investigation into Caroline's death ended with a confession that could never undo the damage. Her family, friends, and loved ones would have to live with the painful reality that her final days were filled with fear and helplessness. But through it all, Caroline's voice, the voice she had fought so hard to protect, was finally heard. Her family, devastated by the loss, vowed to ensure her death wasn't in vain. They became advocates for domestic violence awareness, hoping to help others recognize the signs of abuse before it was too late. Caroline's legacy would not just be one of tragedy, but of a woman who tried again and again to escape a controlling marriage. Her story would live on not only through the memory of her strength, but through the fight to protect those trapped in similar situations. As Babis Anagnostopoulos sat in the interrogation room, the weight of his confession settled over him. For months he had maintained a perfect facade, the loving husband, the devoted father. But now, everything was crumbling. The man who had carefully crafted an image of success was now confronted with the truth. He had brutally murdered his wife, Caroline Crouch, in an act of desperation and control. The detectives pressed him with unrelenting questions, and his earlier calmness began to crack. The evidence was overwhelming: digital footprints, contradictions in his story, and the testimony of those closest to Caroline. His narrative began to unravel. Finally, Babis admitted to smothering Caroline in her sleep, then staging the scene to look like a robbery. His carefully constructed lies about intruders, a bound husband, and a dead dog fell apart under scrutiny. For Caroline's parents, the confession was a devastating revelation. They had suspected trouble in Caroline's marriage but never imagined it would end in murder. They asked themselves, could they have done more? Their grief was compounded by the haunting realization that even with their love, they couldn't protect her from the man who was supposed to cherish her. Caroline, the strong and kind woman they had known, had fought for her daughter's safety, even as she was trapped in a controlling relationship that drained her spirit. As the trial began, Babis faced more than just murder charges. His actions revealed the depths of his cruelty toward Caroline and their dog, Roxy, whose death was part of his staged crime scene. The trial uncovered the psychological manipulation he had used to isolate Caroline, stripping her of her independence and making her believe she needed him. When she finally found the courage to leave, he saw it as a threat to his perfect life. The case became a symbol of the silent epidemic of domestic violence. It wasn't just about the murder. It was about the hidden abuse that had been taking place for years, the manipulation that had pushed Caroline to the edge, and the terrifying truth that the man she once loved had become her tormentor. The verdict was delivered. Babis was sentenced to life in prison for the premeditated murder of Caroline, the cruelty toward Roxy, and the lies he had spun to cover his tracks. As the courtroom fell silent, Caroline's family felt the weight of their loss. Justice had been served, but it would never bring Caroline back. Lydia, their young daughter, would grow up without the mother who had fought so fiercely to protect her. That void would never be filled. But Caroline's parents refused to let their daughter's death be in vain. They became vocal advocates for domestic violence awareness, sharing Caroline's story in the hope that others might recognize the signs of control and manipulation before it was too late. They wanted Lydia to know the strength and resilience her mother had shown, even in the darkest times. Caroline's legacy would not just be one of tragedy, it would be one of a woman who had fought for freedom, even in the face of overwhelming fear. Outside the courtroom, public opinion shifted. At first, many had sympathized with Babis, the grieving husband. But as the truth emerged, the narrative changed, revealing his darker side. The case sparked a national conversation about the dangers of control and manipulation in relationships, and the urgent need for better support systems for victims. Through their grief, Caroline's parents hoped to give others a fighting chance, raising awareness to prevent another tragedy like Caroline's. Her death had ignited a movement, one to give voice to the voiceless and fight for a future where no one has to live in fear. Caroline's story would live on, not only through the memory of her strength, but through the ongoing fight for justice and the protection of those trapped in abusive relationships. The murder of Caroline Crouch was more than just a tragic event. It became a powerful catalyst for conversations about domestic abuse, control, and the hidden dangers that often go unnoticed. The aftermath of May 11, 2021, left Caroline's family shattered, but it also sparked a broader societal shift in how we view abusive relationships. The case shone a harsh light on the complexities of control in relationships, the ways victims are often silenced, and the urgent need for the justice system to better protect those at risk. In the wake of the trial, Caroline's parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter, became outspoken advocates for victims of domestic violence. Their grief, once private and consuming, transformed into a driving force for change. They shared their pain not to seek sympathy, but to educate the public on the hidden nature of domestic violence. They began speaking out about the psychological and emotional manipulation Caroline had endured, a manipulation that had turned her life into a prison. Caroline's diary, discovered after her death, revealed the crushing isolation she had faced, and for her parents, reading her final words was a bitter realization that they couldn't protect her. Yet they also recognized that her experience was not unique. There were countless women in similar situations, their cries for help ignored or dismissed. In memory of their daughter, Caroline's parents launched a foundation dedicated to raising awareness about the signs of domestic violence and providing support to victims trapped in abusive relationships. The foundation aimed to offer resources, counseling, and legal aid to those in need, helping them break free before it was too late. The media, initially focused on the shocking details of the murder, eventually turned its attention to the deeper issues at play. Caroline's case became a symbol of the countless women who suffer in silence, often too afraid to leave or speak out. The case highlighted how victims are often too isolated to seek help, and how society often fails to see the psychological abuse that often accompanies physical violence. The media used its platform to educate the public about the hidden nature of domestic abuse and the red flags that can go unnoticed until it's too late. One of the most significant shifts in public perception was how the age gap in Caroline and Babis's relationship, once romanticized, was now seen as a warning sign. The trial revealed how the power imbalance between a grown man and a young woman had played a key role in Babis's ability to control Caroline, emotionally and psychologically. The case sparked broader conversations about the dangers of age gap relationships, particularly when one partner is a teenager and the other an adult, and the ways these relationships can be exploited. The case also called attention to the need for reform in law enforcement procedures. The investigation into Caroline's death ultimately led to Babis's conviction, but many questioned whether the signs of abuse could have been spotted earlier. Domestic violence advocates pushed for better training for police officers on how to recognize the subtle signs of control and manipulation, not just physical violence. The case became a rallying cry for better support systems for victims and stronger laws to protect those in abusive relationships before violence escalates. Perhaps the most lasting impact of Caroline's death was the legal reforms that followed. In the years after the trial, Greece and other countries began to amend their domestic violence laws, expanding legal protections for victims of psychological abuse. Caroline's case highlighted that abuse isn't always physical. It can also be mental, emotional, and financial. Victims who had previously been unable to seek help because their experiences didn't fit the traditional definition of domestic violence were given new hope by these legal changes. Internationally, Caroline's story resonated deeply. Women across the world found their own struggles reflected in her fight for freedom and her ultimate tragic death. The case became a reminder that abuse is not always visible. Sometimes it's the manipulation, the gaslighting, and the control that leave the deepest scars. For Lydia, Caroline's daughter, the pain of losing her mother would last a lifetime. Yet, in time, she would grow up surrounded by a community that honored her mother's memory and the courage Caroline had shown in trying to protect her family. Caroline's parents vowed to ensure that Lydia would always know the truth, that her mother had fought for her freedom, for her life, and for her daughter, even when it seemed impossible. The case of Caroline Crouch was tragic, but it was also a turning point. It sparked a wider conversation about domestic violence, the dangers of control, and the need for society to look beyond the surface. It served as a reminder that behind every closed door there is a story, one full of pain and fear, but also of strength, resilience, and ultimately, hope. It is a story that reminds us to never underestimate the power of control and never ignore the silent cries for help.